Well, welcome to Week 1, Video 1 for PSC 355, International Political Economy. And in this video, we're going to consider the economic case for trade. We're going to begin each of these videos with a question, and that's the central question that video will aim to answer. And our question for this video is, why do countries trade? You probably already have an idea of what trade is, but a basic definition is the exchange of goods and services across national borders. So why do countries trade? Why not, say, produce all of our shirts and all of our shoes and all of our computers domestically? And why should we produce goods and export them to other countries, say? Well, it turns out that countries trade because they're different. Differences among countries form the basis of what economists call comparative advantage. A state's comparative advantage depends on its opportunity costs for producing various goods and services. Now, we're going to come back to this in a moment, but I want to briefly define what opportunity cost is. Opportunity cost is the benefit that you could have received by taking an alternative action. So if you make the decision to attend a college class in the morning, you've given up another benefit, sleeping in. In other words, the opportunity cost for attending that class was sleeping in. So, how does opportunity cost relate to comparative advantage in trade? Well, let me give you an example, and we're going to use a hypothetical case here. Let's imagine that we only have two countries in the world. Okay, we'll keep it real simple, the United States and China. And let's also assume that only two products are manufactured in the world, shirts and computers. Now, what this table shows is the amount of labor needed in each country to produce one shirt and one computer. So you can see there in the first row, the United States, it takes 1 unit of labor, or 1 worker, to produce a shirt and 1 worker to produce a computer. In China, it takes 2 workers to produce a shirt and 20 workers to produce a computer. Now, what is the opportunity cost for each of these countries to produce one shirt? Well, let's look at the United States for a moment. If the United States sends one of its workers to produce a shirt instead of a computer, how much has it given up in terms of computers? How many computers does the US give up, to put it differently, if it diverts one worker to produce a shirt? Think about that for a moment. If you said 1, you're correct. Right? We can put 1 unit of labor over the 1 unit of labor needed to produce a computer, and we can see that each worker in the United States that produces a shirt means the United States ends up with 1 fewer computers as well. Now let's take a look at China. In China, what is the opportunity cost for producing 1 shirt? If you said 1/10 of a computer, then you're correct. If we look at this again, it takes 2 workers in China to produce a shirt, but 20 workers in China to produce a computer. 2 over 20 is the equivalent to 1/10. So in other words, for every worker in China that produces a shirt, China gives up 1/10 of a computer, the benefit it could have obtained from an alternative course of action. Now, what does this tell us? What is lower here, 1 or 1/10? What is the lower opportunity cost? Obviously, it's 1/10. And what this indicates is that China has a comparative advantage in shirt production. That is, it has a lower opportunity cost in shirt production than the United States. So, we know in this basic two-country, two-product model that China has the comparative advantage in shirt production and the United States has comparative advantage in computer production. So what does all this have to say about trade? Well, let's add a little bit more detail to this model. Let's imagine the United States has 100 units of labor, 100 workers, and China has 400 units of labor, or 400 workers. Now, let's consider why trade is beneficial. So in this first model, we're going to consider an autarkic or completely closed economy. In other words, there's no trade in this model. Here, the United States decides to send 80 units of labor to make shirts and 20 to make computers. On the other hand, China sends 160 units of labor to make shirts and 240 to make computers. We can see there for China that with 160 units of labor at 2 units of labor per shirt yields 80 shirts for China, and 240 divided by 20, the amount of workers it takes to produce a computer in China, yields only 12 computers. In the United States, it's directly relational to the number of workers since it's 1-to-1. In other words, under closure, the United States gets 80 shirts and 20 computers, and China gets 80 shirts and 12 computers. Now, let's imagine a second hypothetical, a world where each country specializes in producing the goods that it's comparatively advantaged towards producing. So we said the United States has a comparative advantage in computer production. So here the United States sends all 100 workers to produce computers. On the other hand, China sends all 400 workers to make shirts. Now we know in the United States it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so the United States gets 100 computers for all of its 100 workers. On the other hand, China sends 400 workers to produce shirts. It takes 2 workers in China to make a shirt, so we take 400 divided by 2, and we get 200 total shirts in China. But of course, the United States needs some shirts and China needs some computers. So specialization only yields benefits to each party if we trade. So let's imagine a hypothetical third world. In this scenario, what happens is the United States trades 30 computers to China for 100 units of shirts. In this case, we can see the benefits of specialization because each country now produces more of what it specializes at and can trade to the other country what it doesn't need and get from that other country what it does need or want to consume. You can see that the total amount of shirts and computers produced in the specialization model and under the trade model is higher in absolute terms than the total number of shirts and computers produced under closure. And through trade, both countries receive absolutely more of each of these goods. If you take a look at Turkey on the far left, the United States has 80 shirts and 20 computers. If you look at the far right, under trade, the United States has 100 shirts and 70 computers. Similarly, China on the far left has 80 shirts and 12 computers, but on the far right has 100 shirts and 30 computers. In other words, both the United States and China gain in absolute terms from trade.